Thank you for this invitation to speak. RCEP is not only the world's largest free trade organization, it has a still greater significance because its core in East Asia plus Australasia is by far the most dynamic area of the world economy, contributing by far the largest percentage of world growth. Although this point is said quite often, the real scale of this importance of RCEP is still frequently not stated exactly and therefore can be underestimated. Also, the precise dynamic of the various countries within RCEP and their roles in the expansion of China's trade illustrates a key trend, the continuously and greatly increasing role of developing countries. The aim of this presentation is therefore to show in precise numbers just how crucial RCEP will be for the world economy, far more important than the traditional economic centers of the US and EU. Secondly, it is to look at the dynamics of trade of the different countries within this bloc. In this, I'm going to concentrate on the latest projections of the IMF, not because these will be totally accurate to a few decimal points, but because the geographical differences in world economic growth are so large that they leave no doubt as the overall situation, whatever are the inevitable changes in individual details. Taking first projections over the next 5 years, Figure 1 shows the total projected growth by the IMF from 2022 to 2028 at current dollar prices for RCEP and the traditional economic centers of the US and EU. In that 5-year period, the total GDP of countries within RCEP is projected to grow by $13.3 trillion, the US by $6.9 trillion, and the EU by $4.5 trillion. In terms of individual economies, RCEP's growth will be 93% bigger than the US and 197% bigger than the EU. RCEP's growth will also be 17% larger than the US and EU combined. Turning to what this represents in terms of contribution to world growth, Figure 2 shows that at current exchange rates, during the next 5 years, RCEP will account for 38.3% of world growth, the US for 19.8%, and the EU for 12.9%. This means that only 33% of world growth will take place in the US and the EU, while 67% will take place outside the US and EU. This means in terms of the world situation, China faces 38% of world growth will take place in RCEP, 33% in the US and EU, and 29% in other countries. But this data at current exchange rates, striking as they are, actually understates RCEP's role in the world economy. The IMF itself prefers to use calculations based on the contribution to the world economy calculated in purchasing power parities, that is, adjusting for different price levels in different countries. This is also a crucial measure for trade, as this indicates the likely changes in volumes of production and sales in the different countries. Taking PPP measures, Figure 3 shows that the contribution of RCEP to world growth in the next 5 years will be 21.6 trillion, compared to 6.9 trillion for the US and 6.4 trillion for the EU. That is, measured in our PPPs, RCEP's contribution to world growth will be 64% bigger than the US and EU combined. Taking the other economic centers individually, RCEP's growth will be 314% of the growth of the US and 342% of the growth of the European Union. Turning to what such changes represent in terms of contribution to world growth in PPPs, Figure 4 shows that during the next 5 years, RCEP will account for 36.2% of world growth, the US for only 11.5%, and the EU for only 10.6%. This means that only 22% of world growth will take place in the US and the EU, while 78% will take place outside the US and EU. In terms of the changes in the world situation measured in PPPs that will face China, 36% of world growth will take place in RCEP and only 22% in the US and EU, 42% in other countries. What do these numbers mean for China's trade? From the point of view of China's exports, and therefore China's key exporting cities such as Yiwu, while the changes in GDP of RCEP countries is very important because it indicates the change in the size of the markets, even more directly important is the trends in these countries' imports, and therefore the potential for China's exports. Here, unfortunately, it is not possible to see IMF predictions for RCEP as a whole because the IMF does not make projections for the value of exports in dollars or local currencies, but it does make projections for import volumes. From these, it is possible to see clearly the projected overall shape of trade changes which are predicted in the next 5 years. These are shown in figure 5. The most dynamic part of the development of RCEP's trade is in the developing countries in Asia. As may be seen, import volumes in these countries is projected in total to rise by 33.9% in the next 5 years. This is hugely higher than the 21.4% in the EU. Particularly striking is the slow growth of imports by the US, which is only 7.2%. Turning to major advanced economies within RCEP, it can be seen that they occupy an intermediate position between the very low increase in the volume of imports projected for the US and the somewhat higher level for the EU. Over the next 5 years, China's imports are projected to rise by 14.1%, South Korea's by 17.9%, and Australia's by 20.8%. But it is clear that all of these are substantially below the 33.9% increase in developing Asian countries' imports. Turning to a more detailed breakdown of these other Asian economies, the key dynamic role played by the ASEAN economies is evident. As is well known, China's exports to ASEAN are now as large as to the US or EU, a dramatic change from even 10 years ago. The role of imports by the so-called ASEAN 5 economies, which is defined by the IMF as Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand, are obvious. Their imports are projected to rise by 40.3%. Particularly important in this is the role played by Indonesia and the Philippines, whose imports are projected to increase by 53.7% and 67.9% respectively. This chart also shows what is clearly the biggest weakness for RCEP, that India is not part of it. India's imports are projected to rise by 40.4%. Working out a win-win relation with India is the biggest strategic trade task facing RCEP. Finally, what is the conclusion of this? First, RCEP's role as a key driving force of the world economy is obvious. It will contribute more to world growth than the United States and the EU combined. Second, within RCEP, the role of developing economies compared to advanced economies will sharply increase. Thank you very much indeed.